Marx basically he believed he chose hell, and he did not want to be a Christian or someone who followed God. He believed he was chosen for hell. And in his writings, which you can still find, I think you can find some of them still online, where he glorifies Satan, he glorifies evil. And I think if you trace it back, what is common among all communists, I said before, misery. And that's because of the evil that they spread doing these things.
Socrates said an unexamined life is not worth living, which would imply an examined life is worth living. C.S. Lewis said good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. We live in a world full of bad ideas, and ideas have consequences. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. If you have not already, like, subscribe and share this podcast with family and friends, a show where we examine life contained with philosophies, ideas and their consequences on today's culture. I am Raymond Ciervo and this is Hey Culture. Hello everyone and welcome back to Hey Culture. Back on today's episode, and you guys will remember him from episode 3, is Dr. Raymond Ciervo. Dr. Ray, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Just for those of you or watching and or new to the episode or new to the show, Dr. Ray has his master's degree in apologetics and also has a doctorate of ministry from Southern Evangelical Seminary. You celebrated 50 years in ministry this year.
Yes, on June 30th was 50 years.
Wow. And I don't know if you're familiar with the sport cricket, but that's quite an innings.
Yeah.
That is quite an innings. 50 years in ministry. Also, as I said on the previous episode Dr. Ray was on, really a mentor to many. At the Bible College, we kind of see him as a wise grandfather to everybody, and we really appreciate his heart and his brain. Henceforth, the reason we have him on this episode. Before we get into this episode, Dr. Ray is speaking and heading up the Apologetics SA conference next week. This episode will air on Friday, so the next Friday in Johannesburg. I'll have a link in the description. Dr. Ray would speak.
Yes, that's it. August 30th is the first Friday
Yes.
night, yeah.
Would you maybe just tell us a bit about the topics that you're going to speak on?
Sure. I was asked, the conference title is Who Made God? And I've been asked to speak on that particular theme of who made God, basically looking at why there needs to be a first cause for the universe. And that first cause has to be eternal and infinite and all the other things we put into who God is. So I'll deal with some of that, look at some of the logical part of that, why we need to have the first cause. And that cause is an uncreated being, and we'll deal with that. My second one deals with the problem of evil. So I'll look at the problem of evil, what evil is, and how we justify evil in a world with a God who is good and a God who is all-powerful, and yet evil exists. It's one of the arguments that the atheists or skeptics will put at Christians is how could God exist, a good God exist, if there's so much evil in the world? So we'll deal with that as well. So those are the two topics that I'll deal with on Friday night.
Definitely relevant topics, and I would implore and encourage anyone who ever wondered about that. I know I did as a child especially, to come into the conference, and there's a Q&A session at the end. So any questions that you have for Dr. Ray, you just fill in those questions and we'll get them answered. To get into today's episode, as mentioned earlier on previous episodes, we are hanged up with the idea of ideas have consequences. And the main idea we're going to look at today is Marxism. Dr. Ray recently wrote a paper on Marxism, and henceforth I asked him to be on today's episode, and hopefully a bit later a mutual friend of ours is going to join in. He's running a bit late, but he's going to join in and also give his perspective on his studies he did on Karl Marx. Dr. Ray, to start us off, what is Marxism?
Well, Marxism is really the ideology It's one way of expressing it. Some people don't agree with that idea that it is an ideology, but it's the ideology of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. The relationship between those two men was that most of the ideas were Marx's ideas, but Engels was really good at writing it out, especially translating it into English. Which is, if you've never read the Communist Manifesto, you should do that. If I could read a quote from Aristotle, he said that men start revolutionary changes for reasons connected with their private lives. And I think it's a great quote. It's one that Karl Marx really puts into. So we look at as we look at what Marxism is, you realize that it came out of his life. He lived a very, he regretted his life. He didn't enjoy life. And for some reasons, there weren't bad reasons, but he definitely saw the world a certain way, and he thought that he could change it. And we'll unpack that as we go along, how he thought he could change the world. And Marxism, based on the life of Karl Marx, you can't really separate the two of them, wants to level out the playing field for everyone. And that's really what he's after doing, so that there are no haves and have-nots. There's only haves. Everybody has a piece of it, and an equal piece of it for that much.
Okay, I think the first order of business with them would be, if the personal life is such a big influence, who is Karl Marx, or who was Karl Marx?
Yeah, Karl Marx came from a family that I believe was Jewish in origin, and at some time assimilated their Jewish roots into I know his parents did, into more of a formal Catholic or Christian idea. And it was mainly because of where they lived in Germany, and it was beneficial both for him and for Frederick Engels that that their families would do that. And Karl Marx basically started his writings when he was in university and wrote the Communist Manifesto. A lot of people don't realize, still a pretty young man. He's probably early, before he was 30. He wrote the Communist Manifesto, which is, as I mentioned earlier, just worth reading to get his ideas. But you could tell from some other writings, people who have researched Karl Marx, read his letters, wrote a lot of poetry. And one of the things he said is that he was chosen for hell, that he didn't believe there was a heaven, but that he was chosen for hell. He actually has that as a part of a verse of one of his poems. And I think that really gives you the foundation, and all his other ideas stem from that idea. People will quote Karl Marx saying that religion is the opiate of the people, meaning that religion drugs people from seeing reality, and that he was going to reveal reality to everybody else in the way that he saw it. And he wrote a lot of poetry, and a lot of it involved Satan. I don't know that we have evidence that he was a Satan worshiper, but certainly he mentions Satan and demonic entities quite a bit in his poetry. And I don't think he ever got past that, but I think he toned it down when he became more of a public person, because when they started to espouse the ideology of Marxism, they were getting criticized. That was one of the reasons why they wrote the manifesto. And he envisioned the world in a certain way, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that, or what the ideology encompassed. But so Marx wasn't a nice person. Both of his daughters committed suicide at some point in their life. They were more than teenagers, they were young women at the time. And I'm sure that colored everything in Marx's life, and it just added to the misery that he was living in. And again, this is my perspective, but I think that's why Marx could see that people had to be misery. Stalin picked up and Mao Zedong picked up that people had to suffer in order to really enter into true Marxism or true communism and be part of a collective group of people. And I think that comes from Marx. I think he definitely was someone who suffered with anxiety, suffered with depression. And again, if you could find places to dig up his letters between him and his father, he mentions these things quite a bit.
Oh.
And his father will even write about it, called him my little Satan. As even in his brother's letters to his brother, they recognize he was a very depressed, I would say psychologically very disturbed man, because of the way he viewed reality and didn't see how life was going to change unless he did something, which, as we know in hindsight, is the Communist Manifesto and perpetrating this idea of how to change humanity.
That is interesting. It reminds me, I think it was on Jordan B. Peterson's podcast where he interviewed a guy who wrote a book on Marx. And one of the things the guy said was that Karl Marx lived off his dad's paycheck still while he was married with kids. Like his father still paid for his life and for him to survive. And it kind of reminds me of the ancient Sophists in Paul's time, that think it's more important for them to philosophize during the day, and other people should pay for them,
Yeah.
which is interesting. Also speaks a bit into who the person is.
Yeah, and he also, I think, Friedrich Engels came from a very wealthy family and supported Marx. And basically, he lived off of Engels' money because he was not getting any money or making any money. And so Friedrich Engels becomes his financier in a sense that. So yeah, between his family and Engels, that's how he's supported, which is very interesting. You know, that he actually didn't work to make money, just propagated this idea of communism, what we call communism.
Interesting that he is seen as in a perverted way, but he's seen as a hero of the working class, or some people would view him that way, even though he was never part of the working class.
Yeah, yeah. He would separate humanity into just two simple categories. One of them would be the haves and the have-nots, or the oppressor and the oppressed. And that was really the horse he rode on. That if you were not of the oppressor, if you were not of the oppressed, then you were an oppressor, and you were someone who was causing pain and discomfort and poverty. You know, he would call working class people, they were slaves of those who were oppressed, even though they would be paid for it. The pay wouldn't be great, and he would look at them as slaves to those who had money and had power and property, which Marx didn't believe anybody should be unequal in that sense. And I have a quote from Richard Wurmbrand in his book Tortured for Christ. He said, all the biblical descriptions of hell and the pains of Dante's Inferno are nothing in comparison with the tortures in communist prisons.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's a man who spent quite a bit of time in communist prisons. Yeah.
That is interesting. I think another great book for the audience to read is the Gulag Archipelago, to really know about the horrors of communism and Marxism. But what is the ideology essentially? And I think first let's look at because I think it started as an economic ideology. So what is it as an economic ideology?
As an economic ideology, I think today we talk about things like equity. And equity is the idea of not equality of opportunity, but the equality of outcome. So equity with diversity and inclusion, they want to see that everybody ends up with the same amount of stuff, whether it's money, possessions. And the ideology is basically that nobody really owns anything. The state or the governing body, whether it be of a country or in Marx's idea, he wanted to go to the whole world. There's a list of things that come out of the manifesto that I read or I use when I teach on this, is that I try to read them in order of how bad they are. So they start better and go to worse. He believed that no one should have ownership of any possession, that there should be, so your house isn't your house, it belongs to the governing body and essentially belongs to the whole collective. So any kind of ownership is wrong. And then he went to nationhood, and he didn't believe in borders. He believed that a person could be more loyal to their nation and not to the party or the governing. So he wanted to do, the way you deal with that is to do away with nationhood. So open borders is what we'd say today, no borders between nations. And then he wanted to dissolve the family unit because he believed that families could garner more loyalty to themselves. Again, instead of that, he made a comment in, this is quite a stark and startling comment, that he would do away with marriage because he'd do away with family, because he didn't want people to be more proud or more loyal to the family for that, and that men should have access to any woman at any time, and women become basically the prostitutes of the state. And people don't know that, but that is part of the Communist Manifesto. Yeah, and it gets worse. He believed he wanted to get away from individuality, so you lose your identity as an individual and become part of the collective again. And you're just another face in a working group of millions, if not billions, of people. There is no personal pride, no personal achievements. You're just part of the working class, and you work for the state. You work for whatever is there. And he wanted to get rid of eternal truths. He didn't believe that there were no, so he get rid of anything that has to do with God. Communism is essentially atheistic religion. And one of the first things communists do when they take power is they start to tear down old churches or convert them into other buildings for that. And just by history, looking backwards, under Vladimir Lenin, they murdered hundreds of thousands of priests and nuns and clergymen to eradicate them from society because they wouldn't abandon. See, what Marx believed was that he could change human nature. He believed that essentially he could create a new humanity that would think differently about reality. So that was his whole purpose, is to be this different, to create this different, become a utopian society, which has never been realized on Earth. It's never really come into existence. And so eternal truths was the one there. And then the way you get there is you eradicate the past. You tear down all the statues that celebrate your past, or at least honor your past in some way. In this United States, where it doesn't matter if first they said that it was these people were slaveholders. That's why they fought for the Confederacy. That's why we're tearing down their statues. But then they started tearing down statues of the Northern Army, and they would tear down a statue of Lincoln, freed the slaves. If they had a chance, I believe. So they want to eradicate the past so that people would forget in a generation or two where they came from, and that he could bring in this new humanity that doesn't have identity, personal identity, and that sort of thing. So that's what, in a nutshell, those are 5 or 6 things. I think I mentioned 6 of them.
That is interesting because we had the same phenomenon here in South Africa with the statues, where they argued for, especially Cecil John Rhodes' statue to be removed, and people, that's, and if you speak to South Africans, that's the first one I think of, but that was not the first statue to be removed in South Africa. The first statue to be removed in South Africa, and Simon Brace is messaging me that he wants to get on, and I'll add him, and he can tell us a bit more about Tuasi's statue being removed. The usual response to Christians when they say God created the universe and all life is, but who made God? If you have questions like these, and whether if God exists, why do we suffer? Did he make grace? Is there a queer agenda? Book your ticket for the Apologetics SA conference, Who Made God and Other Questions, 30 and 31st of August. Renowned speakers like Monique Toussaint, Nakasha Kotze, and friend of this podcast, Dr. Raymond Ciervo, will be tackling these important questions. Tickets are available at apologeticssa.co.za until 27th of August. Whether you want to attend live or virtually, book your ticket now. Okay, we're back. We were trying to loop Simon Brace in, but there were technical issues, so we won't be fortunate enough to have him with us today. But what I was busy saying is that the first statue that they actually removed was at the University of Potchefstroom, and that was of Tuasius, Dr. de Toy, and he was a theologian and a poet, and he was part of the group that translated the Bible into Afrikaans. So a huge figure, but not a political figure necessarily. So that's the first one to remove, even though they chanted for Cecil John Rhodes to remove. So perhaps a lot of similarities going on this side as well.
Yeah, those things, they're happening and they look like they're not connected to everything else that's going on, but like in the States, people would wonder why are you tearing down the statue? And it's not a matter of, well, they were for a different side. They were for the slavery, basically. That's what they think the war was about. Which slavery definitely was a large part of the war. There was a number of other things that have to be considered. I get criticized for that, probably get some email for it. But they're doing it to eradicate the past. They may not know it. This is what Marx called useful idiots, that people will do things for him, or for the state, for the ideology, and don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And so, how do you live into the future without knowing your past? And so what Marx is doing is he's believing that people will, in a generation, forget the past, and or two generations forget the past and be able to bring on this new utopian idea where everybody is equal. There's no oppressor and oppressed. There's just the proletariat population.
So to just clarify terms, the oppressed in his view would have been those who have, and the oppressed are the have-nots.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The oppressor are the people who have wealth, they have power and possessions, and they're the oppressors, and the oppressor are the people who work for them. And Marx would see them as slaves of those people, and so he's looking to free the slaves. He's looking to bring that about. And Marx wrote the manifesto in 1848. So we're almost 200 years from that now. It's well over 150 years. And the ideology is still alive, but it's morphing into something else. It's changing from what Marx declared, what Lenin did in Russia, which was creating the Soviet Union. So those things are still fresh in our minds, but it's even changing beyond that, because Lenin believed it had to be a violent revolution to tear down the strongholds. And there's some evidence that he was looking at the French Revolution in the late 18th century that he brought into the 19th century, that what the French did with getting rid of the monarchy. And trying to distribute wealth again, which never really worked. And it was both Napoleon that basically put down that whole, changed that thing back.
Mm.
There's a little bit of history in there to see how this happened. But Lenin was going off of that, thinking that a violent revolution, he could take it into this ideology of communism.
And they aspire to the world that this is a utopia.
Yeah, that it would be a paradise, a new paradise. And if I could, just say that it really is Christian, if you want, or if you like, it's Antichrist, in that Jesus died to break down the dividing wall and make one new humanity. And Marx was thinking that he was going to create a new humanity. That's picked up later by those who were doing cultural revolution in the United States and in other parts of the world, with Herbert Marcuse and Paulo Freire. Those two men were trying to establish in different ways this utopian society by infiltrating the institutions in the countries that they were part of, change the education system and so on. But they're always thinking that this will be better for everybody. And if it's not so harmful, it's interesting to see what their ideologies were, but they don't work. That's the other thing, is that they don't materialize the way that they think they should, because they can't change human nature.
Dr. Ray, let's go a bit into that. How did it look practically so we had the Soviet Union with Lenin and Stalin trying to accomplish this utopia. We had Mao with China.
Right.
We had multiple Latin American countries. We had multiple African countries who actually tried this. What did it look like when they practically tried to apply the Communist Manifesto?
Those countries, the Soviet Union and between Lenin and Stalin, they basically tried to get, from Lenin, it was obviously a violent revolution at the end of World War I, where they wanted to just get rid of the Tsar. The Tsar and his family were murdered by, even though they were willing to leave, the way that they thought, I guess in their minds they thought perhaps they would come back and change things again. So Nicholas was murdered and his family was murdered. And the history has never been told on how they were murdered, the children were murdered. And it's very brutal what they did. Lenin is probably responsible for murdering tens of millions of people that were not going to be converted. Because through their revolution, they were acquiring other lands like Georgia and like Ukraine, and making that part of the Soviet Union, coming from Russia. And the thing that you see about all of them that is common is that when they come to power, they become the despot. They become the only ruler with other smaller rulers, and they become the haves, the oppressors of another class of people. Wealth is never distributed equally. What Marx really did was have an equality of misery among common people. None of those people feel like they've gained more through Marxism, whether it's under Lenin's rule, Stalin's rule, and certainly not Mao's rule. And they leave behind them a trail of millions of people that murdered, because they won't change, they won't become things. Mao was known to get rid of all the intelligent people, all the artists, anybody who could claim to have something special and be an asset to society. He would get rid of them. Stalin put people in the gulag, sent them away for tens of years to be in a frozen Siberian prison, because he was looking to keep them from society, to make them think about reality. So what one of the commentators says about Karl Marx is that the only thing he was good at was making misery something that was common. So
That is
yeah,
that is sad.
yeah. I think, they're violating principles that have been in existence forever. One of the Ten Commandments assumes personal property when it says, "Thou shalt not covet." So it means you want something that you don't have, but I have, and you want that thing. So the unsaid, it says, "I have something, I own something," and the violation is you want that thing from me, and um, perhaps you kill me for it, or rob me for it, or to get it. But it assumes that people will generally, naturally own things and have things and look for things and produce them. So they're not going by what we call a meritorious system where you merit something because you work for it, you develop it, you invent it, whatever it is. You just get something because you're a human. That you do something that if I have too much of it, they take it from me and spread it to everybody else. And it hasn't yet. It's no matter if it was South America, Central America, anywhere else. Certainly not in Russia. Russia imploded after 70 years of being a Soviet communist nation or union. And Mao had to have a second revolution, a cultural revolution, to change what was already in existence because history tells that Mao was falling out of favor. And so he leapfrogged over his generation of people to a younger generation and brought to them a cultural revolution that was going to really enforce Marxism again, or Maoism.
Wow.
Yeah. So, in China now today is a prosperous country not because it's collective and communist, but because it's become capitalist in so many ways. So they're producing goods that are being sold all over the world. So they're trading to gain.
Is it a fair assessment to say that they kind of, in terms of governing, kept it the totalitarian side of that came with communism, but the economy that changed into a capitalistic economy a bit?
Exactly. Yeah. They the power among the elite of the country, people who are closest to the dictators, and that they free market the economy in certain sections of the country that the other parts of the country have no knowledge of. I have a photograph at nighttime showing the Korean Peninsula, and you could see the South Korea is all lit up because of all the city lights, and it's a kind of an astonishing pound. I'll send it to you if you want to incorporate it in this video. And the North is black, no lights at all, and that's the product of a free market society versus a totalitarian regime that suppresses people. And I think suppression is a nice word compared to how they oppress their people. They become oppressors by being totalitarian and putting all the power in one man.
Whenever one mentions these things or speak about it, people kind of have these usual comebacks or questions. They would say things like, in Mao's case, that they would say in Mao's case that no, but the history is written by the victors, and he was a hero because he stood up against the British Empire and the whole opium thing that was going on in China, and he actually freed the people. Or they would say the same with communism, that the way we are portraying it from the Western side is merely because we kind of the victorious side
Right.
after it. So how do you answer that?
Well, today you have, because of social media, mass media, you can go and with someone like was it Rod Dreher, who wrote "Live Not by Lies," taking a quote from Solzhenitsyn, one of his speeches, and interviewed people who came under communist rule in the countries behind the Iron Curtain, like Romania and Hungary, who were there when they were taken over in the late 40s. And they will tell you what happened to their lives, first under the Nazis and then under the communists. And they'll tell you how they, until they got out of from behind when the wall fell and they came out, now they're free to tell their stories. And you can go and listen to those people. You can listen to people even in China happened because Mao didn't take over completely until 1949. So there are people still alive that lived before Mao took over, and what's happened to their country, what's happened to their lives. So while we could be, say, writing history from our perspective, but we also have the witness of these other people that have gone through it, and just look at the lives that they're living. And Cuba is a communist country, but we don't have people from Florida floating on rafts trying to get into Cuba.
It's the other way around.
But it's we have hundreds of thousands of them risking their lives to come to 90 miles from Cuba to Florida, and that's how do you argue against that? Like I said, there's nobody trying to go across the southern border into Latin America to be part of what's happening there. They're all coming our way.
Mm.
So while they can make that argument, or they can try to make that argument, I don't think that they can substantiate the argument. We're just writing it from the victor's side. And I think, we see evidence of them still trying, and in some ways succeed in the United States by subversion, basically. They've taken the long march into the institutions, to phrase somebody's phrase that was Herbert Marcuse, one of his disciples, that used that phrase, that what they're doing now, instead of trying a violent revolution, they're taking a long march out, a long march to establish his power. They're coming into institutions that way and changing the United States from the inside.
Mm.
And that gets us into what we now today know as cultural Marxism.
Right.
Before we go there, one last objection that people have: how do you answer those who say, but Marxism was never applied correctly or never implemented correctly?
Yeah, the question is why? Why wasn't it applied correctly when you had, in the case of Mao Zedong, when you had the case of Joseph Stalin, where they had complete power to do this, or Vladimir Lenin, where they had all the power, they had all the strength, all the weapons, all the wealth and everything else. Why didn't they just redistribute all the wealth that they got from Tsarist Russia into all the Bolsheviks, the population? Because men are greedy, and men hunger for power, and you can't really trust somebody with all the power, because all the power ultimately corrupts the whole person.
Mm.
So while I don't think Marxism can be applied correctly, because it's just against human nature. We want to own the things that we create and that we make, that we work for. We think that we are entitled to it. Now, capitalism isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than what people
That's true.
are offering us or saying that they want to do. And while it's true the victors normally write the history, it's not true in every case, because we do have people who are telling us what it's like to be in the Gulag, what it's like to be a prisoner in China. And there are people who do it. We have actual witnesses of genocide, trying to just wipe out whole nations. And Ukrainians suffered drastically under Lenin and then Stalin. Millions are killed because Ukraine is the breadbasket. It grows all the grain for most of Europe. And they killed those who didn't want to give up their farms. They didn't want to, become socialists in that sense. So they were murdered for it. And we see
Wow.
that still happening today.
That is, it's and that thing of because being not greedy is that's the kind of the picture we get at the end of Animal Farm where
Exactly.
when the animals are looking into the window, the pigs are starting to look like the humans did beforehand. And those of you who haven't read it yet, it's a good read.
Yeah, and this
Good read.
yeah, and the story behind that, George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm, he was a socialist and went to communist Russia or the Soviet Union to admire it. And he wrote Animal Farm after he left there very disillusioned.
That is interesting. So he went
He went as a socialist, wanting to see how collectivism and communism worked, and returned so disillusioned with what he saw happening in the Soviet Union that he came back, and that's when he wrote Animal Farm.
That is interesting.
Yeah, so and that's why Animal Farm speaks so clearly about communism.
why that both that and I think 1984 also his book was banned out of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Up until that's interesting. But let's get into what is cultural Marxism.
Well, cultural Marxism is, I think it begins with the idea that it isn't established through revolution, by violent revolution, but it's really a political revolution that happens, or a cultural revolution, where what Herbert Marcuse realized, he thought that he could get the West, get the young people in the West, especially the hippies, because one of the things that Marxism does is it looks for the disenfranchised. It looks for the people who feel like they're not part of the general population.
The outcasts.
In his case, it was the hippies of the 1960s that and the blacks who were not satisfied with civil rights and wanted to be violent and do it. He thought that he could incite them to riot, to rise up against the United States and Britain and the Western countries. And that failed. Richard Nixon basically he squashed the Weather Underground and all the underground revolutionaries during the 1960s and 70s. That's something that Nixon positively from an American point of view. And so they went underground, literally. The Weather Underground went underground. They started to take jobs and work for things where before they were violent. They set bombs off, killed policemen, and a number of other things that were very violent in our culture back in those days. And the Vietnam War got a lot of people on one side or the other. So what Marxism does is it looks to get those who are disenfranchised and incite them. And in this case, the revolution didn't work. So they used, it was one of Marcuse's disciples. I want to say his name is Douglas. I don't, I'm just not remembering whether that's his first or last name. But he was one of Marcuse's disciples. And he used the picture of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Long March, that they marched 6,000 miles, lost about 95% or 90% of their soldiers through disease and battles and so on during that time, and arrived at the northwestern part of China by a multitude of young people who wanted to join him. And then he moved back east, and they ended up, World War II interrupted, and both the communists and the nationalists had to join each other. But because of the Long March, Mao strengthened his side, and actually was benefited by both the West and by Russia to drive the Japanese out of Manchuria and China. And then finally he drove the nationalists out of China to what we call Formosa or Taiwan today. They still consider Taiwan a province of China that's just in rebellion. And so they think it's theirs and they're supposed to come back to it. So the Long March idea is that they would sow people into the institutions who would eventually take over. So a lot of people who were the rebels in the 60s became professors going through college and getting degrees in teaching,
Right.
and now teaching a cultural Marxism to the college students. And again, finding disenfranchised people who feel left out. And it's been a couple of generations now where this has all come to fruit, where you're finding people who are either gay or trans, still colored people, black people of color, I should say, is the right way to say it, Latinos or African Americans, and inciting them to start to do things that would bring Marxism in, get into office. They've done it to government organizations, even the army has taken on what we call the wokeism today, where we have aggressions committed against them by the way we speak.
Microaggressions.
Yeah. So if we ask somebody what nationality they are, that's me being aggressive toward them. It's a microaggression, but it's still aggression. Even though I just ask you where you're from, what kind of accent is that? You know, who are your parents? What country did you come from? And you can't. And today, at least at this point in time, all they do is cancel you. They don't kill you. But that'll come if they get in power. That they'll realize you're still part of the oppressive group, and you're still the ones who are causing misery to me. And I have to say, like Marcuse and more than him, Paulo Freire, they wanted to relieve people of oppression. Give you an idea that with Freire, he would look at, he came to the United States, ended up teaching in Harvard, and entered as an assistant, ended up being a teacher, a professor at Harvard University. And he would talk about how he would see people, this is as late as 2007, he would see people living on the streets in New York City, and yet there was a restaurant selling a dessert for $27,000 because it had consumable gold mixed into its chocolate. And he would think of the disparity between the person sleeping on the street that's homeless, and here's somebody able to buy a dessert that's tens of thousands of dollars, between $25,000 and $27,000. And so that bothered him. So he's looking for some kind of equality of outcome to change all of that. He basically was teaching education that turns students into social warriors rather than learning how to reason, read, write, and everything. He was very big in education, and it's said today that he wrote most of the books, or the books that are most quoted in education conferences, on how to change culture by teaching people to be cultural warriors and social warriors, what we call the woke people. And that is that Freire even coined the term that he wanted to awaken people to a new resurrection. He used Christian terms. He was a Catholic, and I don't think he practiced Catholicism unless it was social Catholicism. But he wanted to awaken people, and that's where that term woke came from, to a new resurrection and a new humanity. He thought that their ideology would convert people into a new ideology, and that obviously the true resurrection was not enough to change people. So he introduced an anti-Christian idea that he could change people, which is what comes from Marx. That's what he wanted.
So it's not just in your country, but the open border thing across the globe. We are seeing a crisis with immigrants, and it's been a crisis in South Africa for the longest time. And we have xenophobia, and everybody is being labeled as xenophobes. But the fact is, there are illegal immigrants coming in, taking away their livelihood, taking away their jobs. People are getting angry, but they are labeled as oppressors,
Right.
essentially. And you mentioned that they are cancelling people, but not yet killing. But we have people dying, and especially with the trans movement, we have people suffering physical disparities because of these ideologies, which is horrifying to me. But yeah, it's interesting to see. And one of the other points you mentioned is the attack on a nuclear family.
Mhm.
How so? You mentioned Marx wanting to accomplish that.
Right.
Do we see the same thing in cultural Marxism?
I think it comes back to identity and no one having a personal identity. You mentioned briefly the whole trans things, where men can become women and women can become, or males can become females and females can become males, simply because of gender identity that they leave in mind. So that's part of destroying the family. Um, you can't have you can't have the nuclear family where you have a husband, wife, and children when you start having people changing their identity and promoting it. That it's California wanted to become, and I think they did, if I remember right, the first state where someone who had even operational drugs or whatever, that they could go to California as minors without doctor's scripts and anything and get what they needed to trans into something else. And I think there's some other Midwestern states, and they're producing irreversible damage, to quote a book that was written not too long ago. And it talks about what happens, especially to young girls who start taking male hormones, and how they lose their femininity. They can no longer function as a woman. They can't have children, and distort their bodies in ways that they'll never be able to go back. So it's irreversible damage. And I don't know. I don't know how they deal with that psychologically, how they adapted or adjusted to it. But we see in that. And when you talk about open borders, the left side of our government and the far left want to give everything that is part of American society or welfare, give anybody who comes across hospital care for free, so health care for free, give them a certain amount of money and a bus ticket or a plane ticket to go wherever they want in the country. In the meantime, destroying the population that lives along the border and not letting those people progress and make money in their livelihoods, rob their livelihoods. So we see the conflict that's happening there. And it's amazing that there are some people that think that's okay. If I jump off this subject onto the whole thing with Palestine and Israel, genocide is a dirty word unless you're talking about the genocide of Israelis. Then it's not a genocide anymore. When they say from the river to the sea, they want that to be Palestine with no Jews in it at all. And so they don't have a problem with genocide.
And I want to call everybody oppressed, but one of the most oppressed people groups in history, the Jews.
Have been the Jews.
But there's no social justice for them.
No.
They are seen as oppressors.
Right. Right. And Jews have survived. Joanne and I have talked about this. My wife and I have talked about this. How they still somehow survive under the worst circumstances, that you could only think it's the providence of God that favors them to do this. Because by all accounts, the odds are always against them. And yet they always come up surviving. So you have to think about that. How did they do that? Where other people would just disappear.
Yeah, die out.
Yeah. They wouldn't be able to survive or stand up with it at all.
With this, is it appropriate to say that we are in a culture war?
Absolutely.
And that being the case, what is the appropriate way for us as Christians to fight in this culture war?
That's a great question. I hope that it never comes to violence. I wish I could say it'll never come to violence, but I can't. I don't think that in good conscience I could say that. And I think the avenues, I don't think this is the panacea that'll solve it all. But Christians have to learn what's going on. They have to get their heads out of the sand and recognize what's happening on, and recognize that this is a spiritual war. This is not just a cultural war. This is a war that wants to rob at least the Christian community of their beliefs, and because it is anti-Christian. Dare I say it's the spirit of Antichrist. It's against the resurrection. It's against. It wants to have a new resurrection. It wants to put something in the place of that to change people. Where the gospel is the only way that truly changes people. And I think that we can be overcomers and overcome this if we follow Jesus into it. I know that's a broad statement, but I think it's becoming more devout in our Christianity and love their own lives, but willing to sacrifice our lives for the gospel and to love the unloving, the ones that aren't loving us back, and the ones who want to cause us harm. Because I think underneath it all, I don't think it, I believe it, is a hatred for Jesus Christ. It's a hatred for Christianity and what Christianity stands for. And I believe that that's really what drove Marx. I'm not sure if we talked about it before we went on the air, and we talked about it after, but Marx basically he believed he chose hell, and he did not want to be a Christian or someone who followed God. He believed he was chosen for hell. And in his writings, which you can still find, I think you can find some of them still online, where he glorifies Satan, he glorifies evil. And I think if you trace it back, what is common among all communists, I said before, misery. And that's because of the evil that they spread doing these things. So that Christians have to realize all of that. And realize that people aren't the enemy. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. And I think that that would be the spiritual side of it. The other one is that we have to back the people who will stand for humanity the way that I believe the gospel expects us to, that we are God's creatures, created in his image, with freedoms of possession of goods, meritorious that we work for. And I think we have to, briefly, this is the way I would say those things. We have to really see what the scripture talks about, what humans are. And we're benefited by Christianity and, of course, preach the gospel.
Amen.
Thank you for that. And before we end off, what are there any books or resources that you would recommend for the viewers that they can go and look at?
Let me just bring some of these up on my iPad here. Yeah, there are several books. The one that I was just quoting from is by Paul Kengor. It's called The Devil and Karl Marx. And that's an important one. If you want to know the history of communism and its spread from Karl Marx, even goes a little bit before where Marx, I think, picked up a lot of it from, is a book called Unhumans, UN, humans, Humans, and that's by Jack Prozalik and Joshua Liesel. And I think that book is very good, looking at the history of Marxism as it progressed through time. Those are two really good books. Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher is a very good read. It's a manual for Christian dissidents. I've read all of these things. There's one, I can find it here. Tortured for Christ, of course, by Richard Wurmbrand is an important one. think that's another excellent book to read. Shepherds for Sale, what's happening to people who are Christian pastors who are selling out to the woke ideology. And
Then
those are just a few that I would say. Beneath Sheep's Clothing is also a really good book.
that is a good title.
Yeah.
Shepherds will say as well.
Two books I would just like to mention is we mentioned it, Animal Farm. I think gives a good poetic illustration of what happened in Soviet Russia with the revolution, and then also the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, just to show the dire consequences of communism. And then there are multiple public intellectuals that aren't necessarily Christians that are fighting this thing in the culture war. I think of Douglas Murray, I think of Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro.
Right.
Ben Shapiro being a Jew, Jordan Peterson looking to be more of a cultural Christian.
Right.
He's not too straightforward about what his faith is. And multiple Christian apologists.
You mentioned Thomas Sowell too.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell as well.
Inside American Education is a very good book. It looks at how American education has been changed. That's an excellent book to read as well. Yeah, there's more than a few to get your teeth into it and start to see what's going on there.
Dr. Ray, it's been a great discussion. It's definitely been a good introduction to what Marxism is, the roots and the branches. It's been good. It's been good.
I know Simon Brace has done a lot of research as well. And
Unfortunately,
we couldn't get him on. Yeah.
But we'll sort it out and I'll have an interview with him in the future.
Yeah.
We'll sort the technology out. Once again, thank you. Good luck with your preparation for the upcoming conference. Guys, please remember to buy a ticket now at apologetics.sa.co.za. Dr. Ray, as always, it's a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been good to do it. Good for me to rehearse it too.
It's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm Raymond Ciervo and this is Hey Culture.